Shabbat Shalom. If you have been paying attention, we've been discussing the different stages of the patriarchs as they've come through to us, trying to look at them in a slightly different light than perhaps we've usually focused on. When we talked about Avraham, we talked about him being the first Jewish veteran mentioned throughout the entire Tanakh. We talked about his courage not only in leaving his homeland, which is well talked about, but also his courage in battle, his courage of being willing to fight in order to save his family, in this case, his extended family of Lot. When we talked about Isaac, we talked about him of being not only a patient and kind man, as we see throughout the story, but also of one that is characterized by love, romantic, passionate love for his wife. Something which is not mentioned before and very rarely after in the rest of the Tanakh. So, now that we've had a chance for a week to be reading about Yaakov, not in his parents' home, but when he is away, which is often where you truly see a person's character, what can we say about him? What can we say about Jacob? Not only from what we read this morning, but what you should have been reading for the week when you read the parasha each week. So he seemed to become more cunning. Now this is an unusual idea because Jacob is usually considered to be the cunning one when we talk about our patriarchs. He's the one who cheated his brother, in quotes, depending upon how you look at it, out of the birthright. He is the one who cheated and deceived his father out of the blessing. And now all of a sudden he becomes a schnook, right? He walks into Lavan's house and he can't tell what's up. Well, there is a reason for that, of why he seems to more take a dip in naivete. And that is, of course, he is besotted. Right? He is taken with the idea of Rachel, his soon-to-be bride, although not soon enough, that he wants to marry. And he is in an awkward position. Right? He has learned, of course, about the passion of romantic love from his father, who I'm sure was a wonderful role model of how to love one's wife. And he has found a woman that fits the bill perfectly, but he's got nothing. Right? We talked about last week how Isaac is by many commentators is considered to be the poor one of our patriarchs. But at this moment in Jacob's life, there was no debate. He is the destitute one. He is the guy with nada. So how is he going to win the bride Rachel? How will he win Rachel? He works. He works. He works and works and works. 20 years of work we read about in this Torah portion. No other patriarch is given such descriptions of work. Just straight up work. Right? How did Abraham make most of his wealth? He got a lot of it as gifts in exchange for God not punishing people for the confusion over who was his wife. Whether it be from Pharaoh or whether it be from Avimelech, a lot of what made Abraham rich was given to him. Now, it's not to say that he didn't go through hardships. We know that he went through many trials, but a lot of it seemed to just drop in his lap. Isaac, as I mentioned, there is debate about whether he inherited or whether he didn't inherit enough and whether he had enough, but we don't see him enjoying the lap of luxury. He had what he had. But Jacob is the worker. Jacob, as the paradigm of our patriarchs, is the one who works, the one with koach, with strength. Now, I know you may think, being a shepherd. What's so hard about being a shepherd, right? You sit out and you watch a bunch of sheep, and they eat grass. And when they're done eating grass, you either shear them or you eat them. Easiest job ever, right? I mean, it's like working in a toll booth. All you do is sit there and people throw money at you. What could be simpler? Working in a toll booth ain't easy, and working as a shepherd isn't easy either. As Jacob himself poignantly describes to Lavan at the end of this week's Torah portion, which we weren't able to read publicly today, but hopefully you will take time, if not already, to review it. He says, I was out there, the sun blazing down upon me, the frost biting me, and I couldn't even get a wink of sleep. Why? Because he's out defending the flock. Right? Being a shepherd is not like just somebody who is a dog sitter. Right? Being a shepherd means you're out there with the flock, and the wolves are too. And the wolves don't respect property. And he says, a wolf would eat it, and I would make up for that loss out of my own pocket, rather than saying, oh dear, a wolf ate one of your sheep. Instead, I would supplement that because I felt an obligation as the one guarding them if I failed. And that meant that day after day after day for 20 years, Jacob is working with these animals, out there protecting them, beating off the attacks, slaving away in order to provide for his sustenance. 7 years to provide for his first wife, and he gets cheated. 7 more years for his second wife, although remember, he gets married to Rachel only 7 days after she was promised. He doesn't have to go 14 years without her. He only goes an additional 7 days. It's very important. People often mistake that. And then he has finally paid off his debt for his wives. 14 years he paid and had nothing to show for it except 2 wives and a bunch of kids. Now, 2 wives and a bunch of kids, that's not anything to scoff at. But for most people who will weigh the wealth that they have about their wages from their bank account, Jacob would have seemed like a failure. Right? He could have worked for someone else, had a modest wage, married some other person, and been able to rack up a higher bank account in those 14 years. The Torah leads us to believe, and commentaries will confirm, 7 years of work is far too much for one bride. And yet, Jacob was happy to pay it. Technically, he was happy to pay 14 years worth of work since he was never planning to get Leah in the first place. But that means 14 years in order to have his family, the family that he wanted. And then 6 more years to be able to build up enough of his own to provide for them and no longer be solely dependent upon Lavan. That is a lot of work. Was it worth it? Was it worth it? Right? Should he have just stayed home? Should he have never bothered to get married? Should he have just settled down and become a potter rather than a shepherd? Was it worth it? Was all of that strength wasted? No. Okay, so what makes it worth it? Yes, the section we read today about the different strips of wood and all the speckled and striped sheep and all the other vocabulary that was so much fun to get through. Mm. So this is something that I want to make sure that we understand. Jacob was not somebody who just worked 20 years. Most people work 20 years if they're able to survive 20 years, especially in the ancient world. Jacob wasn't someone who just had hard work. Almost everybody in the ancient world had some form of hard work. It wasn't like there were cushy jobs anywhere. But to work hard, that was exceptional. And what Jacob did was work hard not only with his body, but also with his mind. He was driven in order to be able to succeed through his efforts. He did not sit back and say, well, God has promised me prosperity, therefore all I have to do is wait for the heavens to start raining down sheep. Instead, he said, God has promised me prosperity, therefore I know that my efforts will be successful eventually. Maybe not today, maybe not 7 years from now, maybe not 14 years from now, maybe only 20 years from now. But I know that I will eventually succeed if I work with all of my strength, all of my koach, all of my power, which is what he does. And it's not just that he was cunning, and it's not just that he showed up and clocked in and did the job. It was that he was willing to bend his entire strength towards this endeavor. And he did it, to come back to this question of whether it was worth it, for his family. This is what we see ultimately of his character. He didn't do it in order to brag about how much he had. Indeed, when he gets back to the land of Canaan and he is confronted with his brother Esau, he is more than willing to throw away all the stuff that he's earned. Send it as gifts, send it as tributary, try and bribe his brother to keep him from attacking as long as he can spare his family. It's clear that what he is building here is meant to be enough to support his family, to insulate them from the difficulties of the world, which were even greater in the ancient world, but something I'm sure that we can all relate to now as well. And he did it because of them. And you can see that they understood that. We're going to talk about the various issues of parenting fairly soon among all of our patriarchs, but we can see that at least within the conversation that he had with Rachel and Leah, they understood what he was doing. They saw that he was working for them. Yes, they had their disagreements. The relationship between Rachel, Leah, and Jacob is not as happy as we could have hoped. But they appreciated that he was working for them. And they recognized that God had blessed that, and they recognized that they were all in that same situation, that they were not going to go back to their father's house, that they were staying with him, and they were willing to work with him wherever that would be. And that is what leads them, of course, back to the land of Israel. That is what leads them back to what is truly their home, even though Rachel and Leah had not been born there. It is clear that is where they will belong. And even though Jacob had been driven from there, it is clear he will return and find success there as well with his family. Shabbat Shalom.